Go live. Cool. Hello and welcome everybody to episode 3 of ASTROPILLED. So happy to keep doing this, and we've got a very special guest, Dan Listens To, on Twitter with us. ASTROPILLED, for those of y'all who don't know, but I think that's everybody here, is a demonstration of astrology practice in public, which also serves as a way potentially for the guest to get something useful out of it, or to come away with a sense of understanding of themselves through the natal chart. We'll do intros real quick. I'm Saddle Sood, or Sad, or Sadal, or Salad, or whatever you like. I'm a software architect who's been in the tech sphere for about 10 years. I've been doing astrology for the last 3 or 4, and have naturally applied much of my interest in computation and statistics and computer science to astrology, and do a bunch of side projects and research projects there. I'll kick it over to you, maybe.
Yeah, thanks. I am a budding lawyer, but I have a real passion for esoteric knowledge and magical practice. I'm particularly interested in the intersections between tarot and astrology, and I'm relatively new at reading charts. So for me, the exercise involved in this podcast is really a great opportunity to practice in public, and it makes me really excited, especially to share it with other people who are relatively new to astrology, because I love that combination between like I get to practice something I love in public, and I get to experience that intersection between open-mindedness and skepticism that so many people who are new to astrology have resonating around this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, would you mind giving us a little bit of an intro for yourself? Tell us what your experience or awareness of astrology is, and maybe what you're hoping to get out of this experience.
Okay. I am the meat suit that is inhabited by a variety of strange wilderness creatures. My personal favorite of them is my roommate, who is a grin without a cat, who I'm using as my avatar right now. I too have a long history of engagement with the esoteric of various kinds. I like to think that I take a kind of more grounded approach to it, getting away from superstition and more towards I was about to use the word science, but it's sort of been dichotomized in our culture between like science with a capital S, the institutional thing that we, do at universities and such, and then like lowercase science, which has this more ancient meaning, which is synonymous with knowledge, knowing, discovering. So I think that's the approach I want to go to here. There is a science here, a very ancient one. I've been curious about it for a long time, but this is like one of the divination systems that has just never clicked with me, which I find surprising because I'm an enormous nerd and love complicated systems. So you would think this would be right up my alley, but I never got into it.
Yeah, and admittedly, for many varied reasons, it can be very difficult to get into, whether it's the sort of cultural perception or the barrier that can present, or just the pure like level of technical depth that it can have. So as we go throughout this, it sounds like you have a pretty particular bent towards how you like to conceptualize esotericism. So feel free to guide this conversation a little bit from your end as well, or throw in any questions or specific things that you'd like to know as we go.
Oh, for sure. And just to sort of answer your second question there with respect to what do I know about astrology, it's not my first time having a natal chart reading. I've had about, I want to say 3 of them in my life so far, but it's not been something that has been like a regular practice for me. So I'm still very much naive here, but I know just enough to misunderstand things.
Perfect. And if there's one thing or a couple themes that you'd like to take away from this, maybe you touched on it a little bit already, but what are you hoping to get out of this experience?
Certainly hoping to, sort of take this as a practicum, and I would love it if you would go like over-explain mode on things. That would be really cool for me. And just in terms of like things that I'm curious about my chart today, long-term career stuff and short-term romantic interest stuff.
Cool. All right, I'm actually just going to take some notes there and cut this part out. Career stuff, practicum. Awesome. Okay. Well, then I will kick us off, and as requested, I'll go a little bit deeper into some of the technical aspects. Sometimes we touch on them, but I'll make a point of it. So what we're looking at right now, Dan, is your natal chart. It is essentially a picture of the sky at the time of your birth. All these symbols, as you probably know, are individual planets or stars or points in the sky. So we've got the sun, we've got Mercury, we have Venus, Mars. We'll get to all of these as we go. This is from a geocentric perspective, the idea being that when we're born, the state of the sky relative to our local experience on Earth is what is portrayed by the natal chart. So one tricky thing about your chart is because you don't have an exact time of birth. You said it could be up to 90 degrees. There's certain techniques that we can't use or can't use with as much confidence. We might be able to pin some of them down just based off your experience. But one of the key pieces, besides frequently the location of the sun and the location of the moon, is the ascendant, which does move by 1 degree every 4 minutes, depending on your locale. So I think you said you believe that your time of birth is about 90 minutes plus or minus. So this ascendant, which is the sign that was on the horizon at the time of your birth, or more specifically, a lot of astrologers say the first moment you took a breath unassisted, is currently in Capricorn if we use the birth time you gave us, but it could also be in Sagittarius and it could also be in Aquarius. So when we're looking at these subdivisions, this is essentially a 2D projection of a 3D division of the sky. And so the concept overall of a natal chart that I describe is it's sort of like this: the planets describe areas of your life or your psyche or your experience. The signs describe the way in which those are expressed. The aspects, which are these lines or angles between the planets, describe the ways in which these manifestations interact within the self or within your experience and your life. And then finally, the houses represent the specific areas that those interactions will tend to show up. And because we don't have the exact birth time, we'll need to ask some questions to really hone in on where we think these things are. But there's still a ton we can get out of this just by looking at these signs or at these planets and sign combinations along with the aspects.
So I think that process of honing in on the specific birth time is called rectification. A previous astrologer I worked with did a whole bunch of stuff to try to pin it down also.
It is. Yeah, that's very cool. Do you know, like, roughly, was it the time that you gave us or was it a different one?
Yeah, the time I gave you was the result of a rectification. So that was...
Okay, cool.
I think that we agree, that my previous astrologer thought that was probably good within 20 minutes or something like that, but I do not really recall.
Gotcha. Well, that's awesome. That's super cool. Cool. Then we can ask a couple questions around this and see if they resonate for sure. So when I like to approach a chart, typically a good way to start is by looking at the big three, as well as some major planetary aspects and combinations. So your big three are your sun, moon, and rising, also sometimes referred to as SMR. So your sun is in Libra, and a Libra sun oftentimes we'll have our sun sign, and a lot of people don't know the rest of their chart. They don't see all the rest of this. They just know their sun sign. And so they'll go up and read descriptions on a horoscope and be like, I don't really feel like a Libra. I feel more like a Sagittarius or a Scorpio or something like that, because you've got all these things here. But the important piece of the sun sign for me is that it often represents kind of like the quest or the hero's journey through life. That's how I like to interpret it. And so as an individual having a sun in Libra, it can indicate that a lot of your creative energy is towards interpersonal relationships, towards building ideas. It can also be about the need for impartiality, fairness, kindness, or the ability to harmonize different sorts of aspects and energies. And often Libras are interested in justice and fairness, and they were also interested in intellectualism, in aesthetics, in beauty, especially sort of like a finer, little bit of a rarefied sense, I'd say. And then looking over at your moon is in Sagittarius, also conjunct Uranus, which we'll come back to. But the moon is essentially the core of your emotional self. It is your creature comforts. It's how you feel protected and secure and safe in life, and will typically indicate also how you emotionally just react in general in situations. So Sagittarius moon is a lot of fun, honestly, because it's very enthusiastic. It's very idealistic. It's often reactions are rooted in the personal beliefs and philosophy, because that's very much what Sagittarius is about. Contentment is frequently found when aspiring to or promoting your ideals or progressing towards your goals. And there can also be a predisposition to ask lots of questions, to search for meaning, to find and understand the truth about the world. And overall, it can be a pretty positive, optimistic placement as well. And then finally, coming over to your ascendant. Your ascendant is in Capricorn, and I often describe the ascendant as sort of the unconscious way in which we engage with the outside world. So sometimes it can be an element of ourselves that we don't even really notice, but other people do. I often use the metaphor of it's like if somebody saw you at a party, they'd see 50% of your sun sign and 50% of your ascendant from afar. So that's often how we kind of see the outsides of people, through their ascendant signs. So yours is in Capricorn, and Capricorn ascendant people will tend to have a very sort of like grounded, a little bit of a serious outward approach. It is a little bit authoritative. It is very, can be confident sort of through the hard work and time spent just excelling and learning how to excel at life. Capricorn is very much sort of a business sign, so there can be an element, like if we're to say your ascendant, like your ascendant's the business in front, and then the rest of your chart is the party in back, especially with all the Sagittarius stuff. So maybe I'll kick it over to you from here. What do you see here?
I guess what's standing out to me initially is there's a really interesting overall shape to this chart. And there's these kind of combinations of aspects that really intrigue me, and I won't go into all of them all at once because that'll be overwhelming, but to just briefly introduce what I'm seeing, what I see is like this combination of 3 squares and a combination of 3 trines and a combination of 3 sextiles.
Yeah.
And then one really curious like conjunction that's in opposition to another like almost conjunction kind of thing. And so that like is the overall shape of the chart that I'm seeing. But to just pick out one of those things to start with so that it's not so overwhelming, I think this conjunction opposition combination is really interesting to look at. Dan's moon and Uranus are in the same spot of the sky in Sagittarius, and although as we've talked about, the uncertainty around the birth sign might have something to do with just how close that conjunction is, very likely that it is within only a few degrees. In the chart we have here, they are at the exact same degree in the sky. They're only a little bit off. And I wonder if that might result in Dan feeling like his instincts and emotions can like change drastically in different contexts in unexpected ways. Especially that they're both in Sagittarius. I could imagine this like manifesting in something like having really deep interests in something that you're learning, and then having that like shift gears really quickly or change topics, or like I don't know if you've ever had the experience of like going down a rabbit hole, except the rabbit hole turns into like all of these different rabbit holes that if it was somebody else looking in, they wouldn't maybe see how those rabbit holes were connected. That's sort of like the vibe that I'm getting from that conjunction. And then on the other side of the chart, in opposition to this conjunction, Chiron and the North Node are really close together, which is also like such a beautiful element of this chart. they are together in Gemini, which is a very like intellectual social sign, really loves communicating, and is super versatile, is really willing to pick up all sorts of different fields of study and play with them and see how they interconnect. And also really excited to learn with other people and about other people and about yourself through other people. And so that's sort of like the maybe to the extent that you have a social butterfly, that might be this part of you shining through. But the fact that it's the North Node and Chiron together is it's like a romance story or something like that. Like the North Node can often be described as sort of like the direction that your life is going. It's sometimes like connected to like your karmic purpose in this life. If you think of it in the frame of like samsara and having past lives and future lives that are connected through some sort of karmic like purpose or and then Chiron is a comet that we associate it with the core wounds in our life. We often call it the wounded healer, and so there are often like deep shames or core insecurities or like personal traumas that relate to the placement of Chiron in our charts. And so for these two things to be so interconnected, just tells me this story of like bravery in your life. Like you are constantly finding the courage to pursue exactly the things in life that scare you the most or feel the most vulnerable to you. And they are likely in this realm of like feeling at home in the world, feeling a sense of belonging, being able to communicate yourself to other people and be accepted and understood in that. And yeah, just finding a sense of home in both your surroundings in a more literal sense, feeling landed where you are, and then also in your relationships, like finding those people that you really trust to be good supporting friends and partners in your life. And so to have both of these really interesting overlapping placements in your chart oppose each other brings out a lot of like tension that is at sometimes I'm sure very frustrating, but can also be a really growthful place that's conducive to integrating these parts of yourselves that might not always relate well to each other. But it's an aspect that has a long-term learning curve. It'll be a lifelong path to reconcile the instincts and the intensity around your emotional life, and the way that they can shift wildly at times, and this overall purpose of your life that coincides with this very deep spiritual healing that you're continually drawn to again and again, through triumphs and failures across your life. And so that is something that I see as really prominent in your chart. And I wonder if you have any reflections having heard about your big three, and then a little bit about this conjunction opposition that stands out in your chart. But before we throw anything else at you, what does this bring up for you?
Oh man, that's already a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. In terms of my sun sign, yeah, I've always felt like the Libra attributes are at least an approximate match for me. That one never felt like a mystery. I understand that it has this sort of association with justice or balance because like it's literally a scale, right? I kind of want to say something about that. I'm not entirely sure what the best way to phrase it is because like, there's a huge side of me that has always been ultra sensitive to, I guess you would call them issues of injustice, whether those are in interpersonal relationships in my life or structures within society. I'm from a family that has always been very comfortable talking about politics and has this sort of, left wing oriented justice politics. So a lot of my family background there is going from like 1960s counterculture and the anti-war movement, as opposed to the more recent stuff like um, diversity, equity, and inclusion type concerns. So it's like there's this kind of moving target of which face of justice our society likes to talk about and emphasize. And I've often felt whiplashed and left behind by the rapid changes in that conversation. It's created a sense of discomfort in me as a person who's very sensitive to issues around fairness and justice. Also, kind of, this is maybe that kind of Chiron opposition thing, like struggling to feel a kind of social home, feeling tribeless or outcast, and like caring a lot about fairness and justice, but feeling out of touch with the society I'm living within. Somehow, like kind of an outsider within it has been a disorienting experience for me.
Yeah,
Yeah, that
absolutely.
definitely doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, and I guess since we're there, one of the interesting things I also picked up on this Chiron because it's not just an opposition to this conjunction right here, but also trine to your sun, and your sun is in sextile to this moon and Uranus here. And one of the things that we can point out actually is that your moon and Uranus conjunction, if this is a rectified chart, lands in, or correctly rectified, it lands in the 11th house, which is all about community, people, and sort of the world at large. But you also, moving over here towards your midheaven, you have Saturn very close to your midheaven in Scorpio, and you have a number of things in Scorpio. And the midheaven, as we'll get around to some of the career stuff, is very much about what you put out into the world, but also sort of your relationship to the world at large. It is, the highest, the midheaven is the highest point in the sky at the time of your birth, and it is the most it is symbolic of the most interactivity you have with the external world at large. So it's interesting that you have Saturn there, because Saturn is this very heavy planet, especially in Scorpio, which wants to dig deep into the roots of issues, that wants to understand the truth, that wants to uncover things. And it's kind of almost like we're hearing a little bit of that story, because when you describe that, it sounds like something that can be heavy or very something you take seriously, which are all attributes of Saturn. But it's interesting with Chiron in opposition to this idea of, everybody else, because Chiron in the fifth itself is about your own personal generativity, your creativity, the things that you make, that you enjoy for yourself. And when we have this opposition there, it is kind of like an interesting tension between these elements. And also we have Saturn in conjunct, or close to in conjunct. Well, I guess it's a little far away, but based on whether or not you use exact degrees. So for instance, your Venus is very closely in conjunct your Chiron here, and in conjunct is 150 degrees. And the interesting thing about an in conjunct is that it is a sign, or it's an aspect where neither planet matches by sign element, which is like water and earth go well together and air and fire go well together. Water and air don't go so well together, just in terms of like general temperament and compatibility. Whereas Scorpio is a fixed sign and Gemini is a mutable sign, and that's kind of the nature of constancy of these signs. So fixed signs go the distance. They stick to plans. They once they have something they want to do, they just go with it. That's all very Scorpio. And then Gemini, as a mutable signs tend to go back and forth between one thing and the other, and they have all these different ideas, and they can be a little bit harder to pin down because they have all these projects and feelings that they want to do. And when I look at this sort sort of combination, it does start to paint a little bit of a picture of like you and the outside world, and what do you do with that? Like, what do you do with that existence? Especially considering the fact that you have your sun in Libra, and it's part of this sort of constellation of these three signs. You know, both your Venus, which is an aesthetic sensibility, is connected to your sun by a semi-sextile or a 30-degree angle, and then Venus is a little bit further away, but also sort of this whole stellium here, or three or more planets fairly close together, are mediating these two planets together with Chiron. So like this entire structure is sort of a big story for you. Let's see. And when thinking about this Chiron as well, one of the interesting things is I personally don't know as much about Chiron as I'd like, so I went to one of my books on Chiron by Barbara Clow, and let me just throw some of these phrases at you and see if you relate to these at all. So Gemini in Chiron is described as awareness being the keynote for persons born under this Chiron sign, whose prime existential mission is to understand the way we think in order to affect changes in our mental realities. These individuals are meant to learn that the way we think creates the reality we live in, and that we can change if we believe that. And these natives will believe it when they experience it. The other piece is that it's also trining your sun, and one of the descriptions for that is naturally aware of the potential fluidity and basic power for change in all structures. There can be a great sense of purpose at an early age, naturally responsive to spirituality, can get addicted to a higher consciousness fix of one new experience after another sometimes. I don't know, what do you think of this maybe when you're looking at this configuration?
I'm really interested in the descriptions that you read off, because I think those resonate me from what I know of. They resonate with me from what I know of Dan. I'm also interested because another one of these trines is with Mercury, and the North Node, and that seems kind of like similar and supportive of these same aspects. Dan's Mercury is in its exalted sign of Virgo, and that is it's a fastidious sign. It cares about not just the ethics, like Libra, which is right beside it with the sun placement, but also like the aesthetics of things. And there might be at times a little bit of a perfectionism around it, but at the very least, there's definitely high standards and a strong energy from Mercury and Virgo. And to have that similarly in this trine with the North Node is, I think, something that would also lend to this purposefulness and drive towards this like karmic resolution that will be ongoing throughout life. Just I imagine that more so than a lot of other people with different placements, Dan probably thinks a lot about the future and how to create the future that he wants, and that I imagine would have like short-term and medium-term and long-term kind of focus for his life. Like I would imagine that there is like just as much of a powerful resonance around deciding like who he wants to be next month, that's in comparison to who he wants to be next year and in 10 years, and like how he wants to be when he grows old. Like I imagine that this is just the kind of stuff that weighs on his mind, and that he likes to talk with other people about, and that he likes to study on his own time. Like that's kind of the picture that I get from this combination of aspects.
Yeah.
What do you think about that, Dan?
Let's see. I want to rewind back to the first of those two descriptions you read, Saddle. Can you read that again?
Yeah, absolutely. So awareness is the keynote for persons born under this Chiron sign, whose prime existential mission is to understand the way we think in order to affect changes in our mental realities. These individuals are meant to learn that the way we think creates the reality we live in, and that we can change if we believe that. These natives will tend to believe it when they experience it.
Yes. That one really made an impact. That's a bullseye. That whole description. It's very much a high level encapsulation of my approach to spirituality in general.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of practice, that aligns with a lot of the stuff I've done on that path. Not the least of which is a meditation practice and some psychonautical diving, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So that one really lands. That sort of jumped out to me as interesting. The aspects that maybe was just talking about, there's an interesting conversation to be had there. I'm not sure how deep to get into it at this point, though. I guess one of the ways I would describe my personality is to say I have a side of me that is like almost Vulcan in the Mr. Spock sense of the word, where I have a mode that I can access and sometimes even lean hard on it because it's well developed, where I can lay out logical sequences for things. This is, whether this is at a really small scale, like I have a much greater tendency to plan social occasions than most of my friends do. And I'm the guy who's always like, trying to set up an appointment on a day of the week to be like, okay, we're going to meet on Tuesday at 7 p.m. And like a bunch of my friends were like, huh? What? Just come over, man.
Yeah, I can tell you personally that's Mercury and Virgo for sure. I mean, there's some other stuff, but I also have this placement and I'm the exact same way. So I 100% relate to this. But please keep going.
Yeah. And in the longer term, that sort of logical planning driven side of me is like constantly coming up with like sample narratives, or what's my life going to look like, and now what are the test conditions I have to evaluate to see if I can get there. It is sometimes extraordinarily useful. It was a big credit to me when I was doing things that were part of a more structured portion of my life and our society, like going through university and applying for jobs and stuff like that. I do very well with that kind of stuff. But there's and plans and God laughs. So that comes up a lot. Many times in my life, I have had an impression that things were unfolding according to plan, and like I felt like I was in control and getting what I wanted. This is sort of my approach to desire, is to like plan for it and execute the plan. That's how I get what I want. And then shit happens, because what a world we live in. And I just feel despondent. Like, no, how could you? Bad luck? Fuck that. No. So I'm often feeling like there's like a joyous side of me that really wants to be spontaneous and get away from that grasping planning side of me. It creates an inner conflict. And I don't know, just because of the way I was raised and because of the way I live my life, the planner, the logical side, usually wins and then gets really, really annoyed when the world turns out to not be so controllable in that way.
Yeah. So I'd love to take the opportunity to turn to some of the stuff you've spoken about wanting to get into. So long-term career stuff, I think, definitely falls into this area, because as you described this, I was drawn to your Jupiter in Capricorn, describing, laying out steps, plans, and then taking steps to diligently accomplish them is literally the Capricorn way. And Jupiter itself is a planet that represents where we feel success and where we feel growth and where we really feel like we are, achieving life's bounty or expanding and growing as individuals and people. It can be a source of great joy. And yours is in Jupiter, and it's also, not trine by degree, but it's in relationship to Mercury by sign, in that they're both an Earth sign. So you have these two parts of yourself: the analytical thinking part of yourself that knows how to plan these great designs, and then the Jupiter part of yourself, which tends to be a little bit more instinctive, but will often drive the shape of success for you. That are both working in these earthy ways, which are very tangible. They like to see structures and realities and plan for things and map out potential futures. They are the ones that build the castles, that then get knocked down by life, which is interesting because this is also, you've got your Jupiter conjunct by 6 degrees, your Neptune, which is also quite close to your Mars, which are in Sagittarius with your Moon and Uranus. And these are definitely the parts of you that are probably a little bit more happy-go-lucky, so to speak. Sagittarius kind of wants to achieve its goals and reach for the stars and have lots of fun doing it. Like, that's really the big part of Sagittarius. They're not so much builders, they're more like adventurers and explorers, and they want to, find the truth and then tell everybody about it. But another interesting aspect of this, too, is that you do have a square between your sun, sort of your core identity of this, more internal, balance-oriented, harmonizing-oriented piece of yourself, and Jupiter, which is very like go, 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 go in Capricorn, like let's put our nose to the grindstone, knock this out, like let's kill it, let's win, let's like do all these very aggressive structural moves, like brick by brick is the attitude. But part of the element of the square is that sometimes that desire and that power and that urge can push so far that sometimes you end up overextending yourself, or in certain ways, life just shows you like, that was a little bit too much, like you weren't quite there yet. So when thinking just generally speaking about long-term career stuff, we do look at a few key things. I mean, the entire chart does matter quite a bit because different areas can express itself, but I like to look at the sun, the Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and then the ascendant ruler, and then, so, like, honestly, you look at the whole chart. Like, you see where the concentrations are, and then you go from there. So a sun in Libra will often be oriented with, these harmonizing, fairness, or sometimes beauty, aesthetics, arts emphasis. All this stuff in Scorpio is often interested in powerful, transformative experiences. You mentioned a little bit of psychonautism. There's definitely some of that with Scorpio here. And Saturn, Venus, and Pluto there is this very sort of like intense yet grounded yet like aesthetically driven desire to interface with life and create things that reflect deeper inner truths. And then you've got Mars and Neptune right on top of each other, and Neptune is this very idealistic, very like dreamy, perfect, utopian, sort of unachievable dreams of all these different types of things. And with your Mars and Sagittarius there, it'll tend to make you want to go out and like really just try and swing for the fences, so to speak. I mean, you're not like Mars plus Neptune doesn't swing for the fences. Like, it swings for the moon. It swings for Jupiter. Like, that's how far out it wants to reach. So, I mean, when I'm looking at this, honestly, like with your very particular Mercury, Virgo, and Jupiter here, like, I'm probably reading a little bit too much into the element of like psychonautism, but like you might actually have the potential to become like a Hunter S. Thompson type, with your own personal flair on it. Like that's very much the sort of spirit that I get out of this chart. It's about exploring the reality and also proselytizing about it a little bit, talking about it, sharing it with people, especially, communities. That's one potential look at it. Like, there essentially whatever career you're going to be looking at is going to want to satisfy the elements here. There's a degree of discovery, there's a degree of sharing, there's a degree of building something slowly over time. And then Mercury and Virgo itself is a very skilled analytical thinker, often a very skilled writer. And then with all the Scorpio stuff, that is coming back to the deep-rooted desire to explore and discover the truth. So that's kind of why my mind goes to journalism, but I'd say anything that satisfies these sort of criterias in terms of a career could probably be very viable for you, or may have matched with things you've done in the past. How does that
Yeah,
resonate? Oh yeah, go ahead maybe.
sorry. I just wanted to affirm some of this because I see a lot of these interpretations linked in with the house placements that are involved here.
Mm-hmm.
The Sun and Mercury are sharing the eighth house, which is ruled by Scorpio, and that is like all about like the mysterious side of life, lots of the taboos that we're confronting as a culture,
Mm-hmm.
as well as sort of like the dirty practical part of like career stuff, the stuff like taxes and sharing finances and getting loans and having assets, like that whole realm of like the property involved in career stuff, as well as like the obligations that come up culturally in respective careers, are related to that eighth house. And so with both the Sun and Mercury in there, you're getting an influence in that regard. And then that Scorpio influence, of course, continues into the Saturn, Venus, and Pluto placements, which are in the 10th house in Saturn's case, and the ninth house in the part of the ninth house that is ruled by Scorpio, for your Venus and Pluto placements. And so that reflects that this sign is also having a big impact on like literally your long-term career goals, and the kind of discipline that goes into pursuing them, with Saturn in the 10th house, as well as this drive, not just for education and learning in general, but for like higher wisdom and philosophical thinking that is coming from the ninth house and influencing your Venus Pluto conjunction. And then on top of that, your Jupiter, Neptune, and Mars are all in the 12th house, which also have a lot of these spiritual connotations. It's the place where complexity is at its highest. There is a drive to understand the things in life that are hidden from us, very similarly driven towards the mystery and the subconscious aspects of life, much like the eighth house. And so all of these factors that are coming from the house placements echo this reading around there being some sort of connections between the work that you do around like psychonautic exploration and deep spiritual practice and your long-term career goals. So yeah, I'm wondering if that resonates with you in terms of your curiosity around the career side of things, Dan.
Yeah, it definitely does. I guess there's a few different angles to take on that. One of them is Saddle. You said you were thinking something along the lines of journalism, and I think that brought you in the direction of Hunter S. Thompson, this sort of gonzo journalism. That's an interesting thing to pick up on, because I had a different figure in mind who has a sort of famous association as a communicator about the psychedelic experience. And it's not Hunter S. Thompson, it's Terence McKenna.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Who's less of a journalist, though he did write and he did have a lot of speaking engagements. But I think it's hard to describe his career exactly. Some of the work he did was academic, but that was probably the worst of the work he did. I think he could be described as a poet or a bard, but not of the kind who stands in the public square and sings a song. He was a kind of attractor. He had a way of gathering the right kind of weirdo to him and sort of almost creating communities by accident, because he was not a great people person. Actually, he was known to have been abrasive and unreliable and difficult in a lot of ways, but he had an ability to express his passion verbally that was extremely charismatic and really drew a lot of people in. And he also probably had the same Mercury placement I do, or he had this sort of deep drive towards hidden truths. But the way he would get at it was through, like, the sort of gas in the engine were these absolute lunatic experiences, like just totally going off the rails on purpose. And then really leaning on more structured parts of his life, his analytical mind and his ability to navigate through, institutional structures like academia, to kind of ground it and produce things out of it that in the case of Terrence was like speaking engagements, conferences, books, stuff like that. I'm not really at that stage of my career yet. And I think one of the reasons for that is it took me a long time to get started. It took me a long time in my life to kind of feel like I was enough in control of my baseline survival needs in order to start doing that logical, analytical, the sort of Capricorn style planning process for what to do next. And as we're speaking today, I'm like in the middle of digging a foundation for that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially the part that you expressed about feeling like it's taking you, perhaps compared to other people, a relatively longer time to grow into parts of yourself that might eventually be the most like core and stable parts of your identity, especially related to your career, since Libra is the sign in which the sun is in its fall, and so I find that everyone sort of grows into their sun sign over time, but for those of us who have our sun in Libra, that can be a bit of a longer process. And just since you were bringing up these figures, another figure that comes up to me when I'm looking at your chart and we've been discussing these things is Richard Tarnas, the author of Cosmos and Psyche. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I don't know Tarnas's chart well enough to know if there are any sort of parallels in that sense, but I feel like Tarnas was confronted with the profound nature of astrology and psychonautical experience, and it compelled him to study it deeper because he experienced it for himself, and that was undeniable to him. And in the exploration that came from that experience in his life, he was drawn to teaching the world about something that was hidden from them and mysterious to them and easy to cast aside for them because of the cultural zeitgeist that they had been a part of. And his work really seems to have the same sort of like breaking through cultural barriers and being able to navigate academia and culture in order to do that I hear from you when you're talking about your interests and your aptitudes and the sorts of career goals that you've been exploring a little bit already.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense to me. I do think that Richard Tarnas has spent his entire career as an academic, actually. So it wasn't like a late in life change for him, but you may be right that he took a long time to kind of find his voice. I've read Cosmos and Psyche. That's one of the few books on astrology I actually have read. And, it's an interesting way to present the subject because he chose to create these sort of historical meta-narratives connecting the natal charts of important figures mostly in political history, with the lives and times that they lived in, and found it to be very, very coherent, like impressively so, which was one of the things that made me start taking it a little bit more seriously. But it's not a great book for like exploring the practical side of it, and I often worry about the overfitting thing, where you can go into a subject with sort of a story in mind about it, and use a chart to backfill the narrative elements of the story based on what you wanted to, since there are many ways to interpret a chart.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really tricky thing. And I think it's part of the responsibility of astrologers to recognize their own personal biases, because, you can have as many different types of readings as you can have astrologers. And, there's naturally going to be a lot of overlap if you're looking at a natal chart. But when you talk about things like politics or political figures who you don't get to sit down with and, listen to their thoughts about, it can get quite a bit more fraught. It's kind of hard to say at the end of the day when it does come down to something like Cosmos and Psyche, because even though it's an incredible work and the result of an incredible career and exploration and thinking, at the end of the day, it's still just one person's perspective of these stars and of these planets and asteroids, and you can have a totally different one from another one. I mean, it was really interesting to diverge a little bit, to observe all of the predictions about whether Trump or Biden was going to win. I think there was a public thread of about 100 different astrologers, and the criteria was you had to, write a significant amount, you had to present charts, you had to do all these things to have your guess included. And I didn't get to go deep enough, but it was very interesting to me how it was split almost exactly 50-50, which is pretty much how the political lines fell as well. So there's absolutely a lot of truth to what you're saying there.
Right. And it almost undermines one of the things you would hope for from a high precision divination system. Like this is one of the things that I think of as being a huge difference between a star chart and a tarot deck. I'm much more experienced with reading tarot decks, and there's no way to get precision out of a tarot deck. There's nothing quantitative about it. You get narrative themes, you get storytelling prompts, and you get an almost uncanny selection of symbols and archetypes that craft a story. So I'm fairly convinced that tarot has some reality to it, but there's no way you could ever hope to predict an election with it, let alone stock buying. And I know that stock buying with astrology charts is one of the things you do settle. So I'm really curious as to how you get into precision readings with this kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I'm trying to decide whether or not we should diverge a little bit to talk about this. Well, I'll give you a very brief example. The interesting thing about astrology with finance and stocks is that precision does matter a lot, especially with something like crypto, which is 24 hours a day. And sometimes you can see moves and big pivot points down to the minute with certain aspects. It's very bizarre. But at the other side of things, you also sometimes have those same rules apply within a certain orb. So my personal feeling is that things like financial astrology is really how you get good at prediction, because the rules that we normally use for natal charts don't really apply, because you're always looking at a fixed point in time, right? But when you're dealing with financial information, you have all this history and all this data that you can look at, and you can backtest, and you can see contextually what these different signs did, or what these different planets did. Yeah, exactly. And a big part of that too is that what you find out is that depending on the time of day, or when a stock was listed, or when the first Genesis block of a crypto was mined, the planets that matter change a lot, which I think reflects something very important about the relationships that human beings have to their charts, because it is a well-known rule that you have different types of rulers depending on various situations in your natal chart. The rules can be very, very complex. And then there's also, fixed stars. Some people are born under a fixed star, and those people tend to have very fated lives because those stars often have entire myths, and people live out those myths. So it's weird because there's a lot of crossover, but it's also very different, and it's very highly precise. But with human beings, our lives aren't binary up-down stock tickers. We react, we process, we have experiences through time. We don't realize the importance of an event until months later, and it's only until we look back where we're like, oh yeah, that was the transition point in my life. Whereas with the stock, you see it because it moved, and you can tell, and you can just record it. So yeah, it's very, very interesting. I have found that it works, but it doesn't work in the way that we usually practice natal charts, which makes it tricky because there's a whole new corpus of learning and knowledge that we have to discover there.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to compare with something like electional or psychological astrology as it relates to the events and the forces that are like coming up in human lives. Because with something like crypto, it is naturally objective. So you're coming from this like objective place, thinking about an objective thing, and there isn't really a dissonance there. With astrology as it pertains to human beings, the stars don't respect this duality that we have between what is subjective and what is objective in our lives. The stars speak as much about the things that will happen within us as the things that will happen to us in our lives. And so it can be really tricky when you're trying to do divination with astrology to even find out like if the stars are talking about something that's going to go on internally for you, ways that you're going to be thinking about the world, ways that you're going to be acting out intentions on the world, or if they're related to things that the world is going to bring you from outside of yourself that you don't even on a psychological level like unconsciously attract. They are just like the things that will be brought into your world. And so that creates not just this like multivalence and plenitude of meaning that are associated with all of these archetypal energies, but also this multivalence and plenitude of meaning that straddles this objective subjective binary that we experience from within our own lives.
Yeah, and then you get even more complex because there's certain ideas that house systems are, there's dozens of them, maybe hundreds of ways to create these lines here, and there are theories like the traditional Hellenistic astrologers who are very focused on the mundanities of life and fate, and would even do things like try to predict how long your life would be or how you would die or what job you were fated to have, also because social structures and classes were much more rigid back then. And so they have a system called whole sign where technically all of this would be your first house, this would be your 12th house, this would be your 11th house. But in modern astrology, often the most typical type is Placidus, which is what you see here. And they both work. Like, one interpretation I'm coming over to is that whole sign really describes the mundane events that happen to you and sort of the external expressions of your life. Like, oh, you have this placement, so you often deal with these sorts of issues. But Placidus, as it's described, more accurately describes our internal world. But then you get into even crazier things like, there's different types of zodiacs. Like, there's the sidereal versus the tropical zodiac, and sidereal is off by 24 degrees, and there's a whole different system of Indian astrology that goes with it. And then there's also Chinese astrology, which is vastly different to this at all. Like, it does not look like this. There's not a wheel. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that's going on. Like, there's kind of a wheel, but it's different. I'm feel a little overwhelmed even describing it because the level of things that you could explore and learn and lenses through which you can view these, points in the sky and divisions of the sky are very, very vast and very varied. But that's also why I find it so exciting and compelling.
Yeah, I wonder if that quells some of your curiosity, Dan.
How would you run an experiment in the life of an individual person on a scale that they could actually verify it with? Like, this is one of the things about tarot readings that's always been really striking for me. Even insofar as they don't give you numerical precision, they give you an outrageous amount of thematic precision. Like, it's been uncanny for me in that they seem to never fail, or at least you can sort of get this, I don't know, tingling sensation when there's some juice in the reading, when it feels like it's a live reading.
Yeah. So I do have an example of that. It's honestly pretty similar to tarot if you're looking backwards. So if you're looking back at an event, one thing I have done, and I'm not an expert at this, I just tried it once, is somebody DM'd me and was like, hey, if I told you a time where something, eventful happened to me, would you be able to tell me what it was? And I was like, no guarantees, but I'll give it a shot. And I looked at it and it had like Mars involved in harsh aspect to the moon. And there was some nasty stuff with Mercury going on and a couple of other things that I don't remember. But I was looking at it and I was like, oh, this looks like a car crash. And I told him, And he was like, yeah, I got into a huge car crash. But it turned out that everything was fine. And there's also like a positive Jupiter aspect involved, which can indicate luck. So like all the themes were right there and to the day, because all those aspects were very, very close at the time. So one test you can do for this sort of thematic accuracy plus time, that I do think that's a valuable part of this, which is the fact that you don't only have themes, you also have time that you can project backwards and be like, these themes were active at this specific time, and you can go back and look at it. You could have a bunch of people or a bunch of astrologers practicing and trying to give predictions based on like, hey, we know this event happened. What do you think this event was? Forward prediction is quite a bit trickier, simply because, you know, it's a matter of both what and when. So if you're talking about trying to predict certain key events, like all the planets go around in cycles, and so it can be hard to know exactly which time that Mars square moon or whatever is actually going to result in an injury, as opposed to somebody being just pissed off that day or something like that. So it's very tricky to design experiments with human lives in that nature, but I don't think that doesn't mean we can try. I'm sure there are sorts of experiments that we can design around that idea, but it probably needs to be narrowed down to a range of like, okay, we have a ton of people. We know that they all have this upcoming aspect. Let's do a study and analyze whether or not these people had this thing happen to them or had this experience along this time, and then turn enough. Like, I personally believe that if you take enough qualitative data, like a lot of it, it eventually becomes quantitative data, so long as you can map it out and accurately pull out the facets or the categorical information from it. So those are some of the ideas I've had off the top of my head so far. So I think it's definitely possible.
Yeah, I could see that. And using past experiences as a experimental verification is an interesting approach to it. Extrapolation is messy, of course.
Yeah.
You know, we do that at our own peril. It's almost one of the merciful things about tarot being fuzzier by nature. It doesn't suggest to you that you ought to try to use it to make predictions.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
And because
I
of
very
that,
much
it
agree.
seems to have a present bias, meaning everything I've ever had come up in a tarot reading is either happening like right now, like as we speak, or is in that sort of the base of the cone of uncertainty into the future, where your time horizon is maybe days to weeks out, and it's reasonable to consider that just a slightly fuzzier part of the present tense.
Yeah, I've noticed that too with the tarot. It's very hard to deal with time. I have tried to predict with tarot with middling success, I guess, because ultimately you do still come down to the same thing of these themes, or like the fact that the themes don't fit into binary, yes or no. And they always also depend on your personal relationship to those cards and to those themes, and also your personal bias or just what's on your mind at that time. It gets really, really tricky. And I think you can run into some of the same stuff with astrology as well, which I think can be ameliorated by doing stuff for strangers. Like, I've certainly made plenty of predictions for strangers over myself, because they're like, oh, I want to know about this thing, or how this thing is likely to go on, or just the future is shown in the cards when you're reading for somebody else, and they came back and they're like, yep, all the stuff you said happened in the way you said it was going to happen, which is always pretty weird but gratifying at the same time.
Oh yeah, I've experienced that with an emphasis on the weirdness, where I've had interpretations of readings that were so on point that I found it frightening and like put the deck down for a few months.
Yeah, yeah. I know that feel.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, we're a little bit over. I'm fine to keep going for some longer time if you are, maybe, and Dan.
Yeah, I got a couple more minutes.
Cool.
I wanted to see if I can pick your brain for a short term. So time horizon here is, let's say, between today and 3 months from now.
Cool.
Love life, romance stuff. What's going on?
Yeah. Maybe you want to start with this one?
Yeah, well, I'm just gonna maybe bring up a transit around it
Do
and
it.
see. Do. What was your timeline again? How many days?
starting today and going out as far as, let's say, 3 months.
Okay.
So Dan, I can throw your transits up here, but it will show your birth info if that's all right with you.
Yeah,
or
that's
it'll
fine.
show your birth date. That's about it. Okay. Let's see. Oh. Okay, sweet. Maybe you do the guiding and I'll just catch up.
Yeah, so what I see right now is that what's going on for you in your current transits is that you have this
I'm getting a render problem on the graphic, by the way.
Oh,
I
sorry.
just see a black background.
One second. Let me change that. Okay, and then share. Go ahead. Maybe I'll deal with this. Well.
Yeah. So the main transit that I'm seeing for you right now is that your Jupiter, the transiting Jupiter is in a strong trine with your natal Pluto. So if there is like, a big date coming up, or you're starting to look for a new partner, or something like that on the horizon, this is a time where that may result in some drastic changes in your life, and some, like, intense feelings, catalytic periods of growth, and expansion, and you're more likely to get in touch with your ideals and your goals for your romantic life, like the things that you tend to look for in a partner and the way that you aspire to show up in a relationship. And it's possible that those ideals and aspirations will get some tweaking in the next, like, in the short term future. So you may find yourself starting out looking for something and very quickly finding out that you need to maybe shift your perspective a little bit, or change the kind of people that you approach first, or perhaps change your own approach to other people in some way to reflect something that's going to feel a little bit more in alignment. And it might not feel like a perfect fit at first, but it will likely feel like something that you want to grow into, rather than, for instance, like carrying on a pattern that you've had in the past that fits comfortably, kind of like old shoes, but isn't the way that you want to show up in life as much anymore. So it's like, yeah, I get this shoes analogy coming up for me. Like, it's like you might find that you're trying to break in a new version of yourself in this area of your life, and even if it's a little bit of an imperfect fit at first, it's like moving in the direction of what's going to fit you better. I guess maybe I'll give you a chance to respond to the shortest term before I go on to speak on what your biggest transits in like a month from now look like.
Okay, so I guess my first question is, which planets are causing you to give that interpretation?
Oh, okay. So Jupiter is about expansion, and growth, and luck. So things coming into your life that are auspicious, or intentions that you set that are like in a really close alignment with the things that you really need in your life right now. And then that being in a trine with Jupiter, that being in a trine with Pluto in your chart, means that it's likely that this expansion and growth will, without you needing to consciously put effort into it, align with the longer term transformations that will be beneficial to you. So the idea that I'm getting is that if there are hopes tied up in your romantic life, or goals or needs that you're looking to get met, that need to shift, this Jupiter transit will put you in a good position such that you will be unconsciously motivated to move in the direction that would shift those goals and approaches and aspirations in a direction that's going to be in better alignment in the long term. That's kind of Pluto's domain, is the slow, long periods of growth, whereas Jupiter is like catalytic in terms of growth and luck and expansion. So that's an easy relationship that those two planetary energies have going on in your life right now, and so that's what gives me that interpretation and expectation for what might be going on for you in the near future.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's interesting that you bring up short-term romantic interests right now, because based on your ascendant Mars, which is very much an activation planet, it often will cause things to happen because it's all about like go go go. Is either just now or has recently or is about to enter your seventh house, which is the house of partnerships, of romantic partners, things like that. So it's very well timed because, like, literally to the day, we've had like Mars coming in right now. It's a fairly slow moving planet, so this is quite well timed. Just wanted to point that out because I think that's a lot of fun. And this will tend to activate seventh house topics, which is partnerships, which is other people, which can be romances. And you also have, in terms of short-term things, Venus right in your fifth house as well, which is also the house of just recreational sex, can be. That's one thing. And then let's see. Yeah. And then you have Jupiter coming up onto your Venus, but I imagine maybe he was probably going to talk about that next. So I'll turn it back over to you, maybe.
Yeah, actually, one thing that I was thinking about was actually that since you brought up Mars, that as Mars moves forward, it's going to come into this sextile with your Sun and Chiron, and so that like activation, I kind of see this path of it like. Mars enters the seventh house. It's bringing this drive to experiment and explore your relationship to other people, especially in these like sensually and sexually charged ways. And what I would anticipate is that as that situation unfolds, it will come up against whatever it is in the ways that you feel vulnerable or the limits in your self-concept that historically haven't gotten along well with Mars, and giving you a really growthful opportunity to consciously become more aware of those relationships between different parts of yourself and maybe integrate some of the more Martian aspects of yourself into the way that you see yourself, maybe seeing yourself as a more sexually adventurous person, or as a more attractive person, or as someone who is more able to take charge and drive forward your romantic life, as well as bringing this like courage around the parts of yourself that may be healing from things that you have gone through in past romantic relationships, and maybe challenging some of the assumptions that those experiences have left you with, especially assumptions that you might have kind of carried around about yourself that were there before these romantic disappointments, that those romantic disappointments might have firmly entrenched for you. So that's what was on my mind at the time, and I wonder if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I'm especially interested in this sort of serendipity of the Mars placement in the seventh house. That very much lines up with this sort of personal short-term goal of mine, which I think I said before we went on air that there's something that's still enough in the uncertainty phase that I don't exactly want to speak it aloud for risk of jinxing it, but just broadly on the theme of starting new relationships, getting to know new people, and trying to get out and date more. That's very much been a focus of mine, and some of that is starting to happen.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you have somebody already, because I'm looking at this and June 6th, especially around this date, looks particularly interesting for a couple reasons. You have Mars coming into in conjunct with your natal Mars position, which Mars, to speak bluntly, is one of the sexual planets and can signify sexual activity in your life, especially in relationship to itself. You also have Venus on this day trining your natal Venus placement, so that's just generally good for romantic experiences. And then Jupiter, you have, as we've been talking about, approaching a trine with Venus here as well, and you have the Moon directly opposing Venus as well. So like your Venus is super activated around June 6th. So I'll be very curious to hear, as much as you'd like to share about this event, or, just general thematic elements. And then what's also interesting is that you also have the node approaching retrograde towards your moon as well. So you have this south node on your moon. And one interesting thing about this placement is it's often like a major manifestation point of some kind, so it will tend to relate to events that just seem to happen out of nowhere or are fateful in some way or lucky in some other way. So there's a lot of activation of these two planets. You've got Mars here, right here, and then you've got Venus as well, and then a little bit of moon stuff, so that's pretty fun. Let's see. And this is right before the eclipse on June 10th as well. So this should be kind of an interesting time for you in general, I'd say. Let's see.
Yeah, and one thing I see moving forward from that point too into this more like 3-month range, just to like look at sort of an end point of this like chunk of time that you've asked about, is that these like Jupiter trine Pluto and Mars trine Mars aspects are going to continue into this 3rd month that you're thinking about, but your sun is also going to come into a square with Pluto. And so it's really interesting. Like the picture I get developing is that like both your romantic and your sexual natures are going to be activated by the transits that are coming up in the next like quarter here, and that increasingly I imagine it's going to come up against these reflections on the way that these parts of yourself are tangled up in and perhaps sometimes conflicting with your conception of yourself and the parts of your life that have hurt the most up until now. And so I see this as not just a time for like auspicious, first dates and things like that, if that's what might be in your future, but also that this, I couldn't imagine the intimacy that you would experience in the next coming quarter would be like, even if it was casual, it would have like a deep impact on you. I imagine it like bringing up a bunch of opportunities, regardless of how short or long term any of these potential relationships turn out to be.
Mm-hmm.
It would bring up this potential for reimagining yourself and experiencing some really deep healing. That's kind of like the overall arc from this time period that I'm reading from the aspects as they shift.
Yeah, and another interesting date is around June 20th, you'll have Venus entering the same pocket of the 7th house. So you've got sort of a double whammy of relationship planet, relationship house. You also have the moon there, but this is also the day that Jupiter stations retrograde, and it'll be stationing retrograde in trine to your Pluto and your Venus. And that's important because it can indicate that a Jupiter retrograde is kind of like taking a moment to ponder your successes or to, backtrack on projects that bring you growth or goodwill or good feelings, things like that. So it is really much a kind of like a look back moment in relationship to how you deal with probably relationships with your emotional self, with sexuality in some way. Generally speaking, with Venus and Pluto there, Pluto is also a rather sexually charged planet as well. So it wouldn't surprise me if this is a kind of a pivotal point. One potential outcome of the fact that there are all these retrogrades happening, if we wanted to put a loose prediction, is that, this may not be a super permanent adventure in terms of your romantic partner that you may be thinking about right now, because we are in a period of like major significant retrogrades happening, eclipses happening all during this couple week period. So it could be an experience that's very transformative, but also somewhat transient. That's not to say you can't revisit it later, especially once things go retrograde. But if I had to guess, just based on some of the indications, don't be super surprised or disappointed if it's not a super long-term thing, but also it sounds like that's not what you're looking for right now anyway, so it could be perfect.
Yeah, I love how you frame that, Saddle, because that's what really resonates to me too, is that there's like this potential for some really catalytic changes, and then such auspicious positioning to internalize whatever expansion that brings, and focus on integrating it in yourself, maybe more so than maintaining whatever relationships come into your life that catalyze that growth.
Interesting.
Yeah, this should be an interesting period. I've been looking forward to the June 10th eclipse because I don't know, it's just interesting times all around, and I hope it continues to be interesting times for you in a good way, not a Chinese curse way. Cool. Well, do you have anything else you'd like to run over, Dan? I know it's kind of hard to talk about just us saying stuff that we think might happen in the future.
Yeah.
No, I think I'm out of questions. Here's a high note for ending on. Just a small bit of synchronicity. I received a text message as you were talking about the relevant topic, and I think I have a first date.
Ah, awesome. That's great. Well, that is absolutely perfect. Congrats. That's
great. Yes, thank you for sharing that, because that is such a delightful note to reflect the transit reading with. That's so fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, then we will wrap it up here. Thank you so much to all of our guests who dropped in and out throughout the course. And thank you so much to Dan for letting us peer into your life and being so open and generous with us. And thank you, Maybe, for co-hosting. I will let some music play us out that I will edit in later.
Awesome. Wow, that was great. That was fun. We haven't done a transit reading on the podcast before, so that was a fun challenge.
Yeah, heck yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, we're officially done, so thank you so much, Dan. I'm going to try and pull together a recording of this, so you'll get to go back over it and listen to the stuff that we talked about, and otherwise, I'll see y'all around the internet.
Yeah, and to the extent that you're willing, we'd love to hear what happens on these dates that we've mentioned.
You're gonna have to remind me. Check in on I guess June 6th or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, will do.
Cool. All right. Thanks, y'all. Have a great rest of your night.
Have a great evening.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.